Hi everyone, and welcome to my guide for the Chain Lightning Sorcerers. This is a build I have played a lot recently. I leveled it to 100. I've also beaten tier 100 9 dungeons repeatedly with this, and that was all pretty easy and smooth. So I want to walk you through my setup. I have a default planner here that has various progression steps. It has different setups, for example, for the pushing, for the leveling, for Uber bosses. Right now I'm actually in the process of attempting Uber Lilith with this build, and this is definitely one of the better builds to do that. So you can learn about basically everything there is to do in this game with this one build here. Now, I do have to say that this is not the best build out there. There's definitely better builds. A lot of people always ask me, like, is this better than Blizzard? The answer is no. It is like a fine mid-range build, but most importantly, it is very fun. I had tons of fun playing Chain Lightning. It had received some recent major buffs with various perks just being massively better now. And this is also why I wanted to try out the Chain Lightning Sorcerers. And I had a blast. And the best part about this is there is the Omni Power Heart for the Sorcerer this season, and this makes you shoot multiple Chain Lightnings, and then the lightning just goes everywhere. As you can see here, you have like these tons of numbers, tons of cool effects, and it just feels really good to play. And you don't have to use the Barber to be effective. So this is also a big plus for me, at least. Now, there is also a Barber version, which I actually have here in the planner. So for example, here I actually put the Barber, and I think the Barber is a slightly better choice overall because it just gives you a lot more AoE damage because of those shadow explosions from the heart. And AoE damage is the one point where Chain Lightning kind of lacks a little bit. So the Barber solves that. But on the other hand, I just enjoyed Omni Power so much, I just went with that. And it was fine in AoE damage, and you have this insane single target potential because you can shotgun multiple Chain Lightnings at once into the target, and all of your mana comes back from the recharging aspect. So it doesn't matter how many Chain Lightnings you cast, how much mana you spend, it all comes back. And if you look at my mana here on the bottom right, when I shoot into those packs, it just like comes back between every single shot basically. When you're not struggling your way through some tier 100 9 dungeons, but you're just like leveling up, this build has a blast. It's a breeze, especially starting out in the early levels, like 1 to 50 or so. This is probably one of the best builds out there because Chain Lightning has so much raw power. You can combine this with various enchantment effects, and you just destroy the early game with this. And then later on, you do have to try a little bit to make the AoE damage work, but the mana management is very easy, as I mentioned, and you just have like a very smooth kind of one-button playstyle. So if you enjoy that, this is the build for you. The planner I have here has all these different versions. The one I played the most was the 50 to 100 leveling, and there are some adjustments you do in the early game just to try to be faster and more optimized until you open up more choices later, but I'm gonna walk you through it step by step. As I mentioned, I have these different setups down here in the planner. I'm gonna start with the 1 to 25. I'm gonna walk you through it step by step, and you can see how the setup changes just to be more optimized when you level up this character. And then in the end game, we have like a pretty straightforward setup here that requires very little adjustments to also be optimized for tier 100 pushing, for Uber bosses, etc. And also the Omni Power version only has some slight tweaks in there to accommodate the higher mana output. So let's start with the 1 to 25. When you level this character for the first time, then you want to focus a lot on Arc Lash and Chain Lightning with a bit of Fireball enchantment mixed in here. So this is our AoE damage. In the early levels, this just destroys anything. So when you hit one target in a pack and it dies, it will just like chain react the entire pack, especially with small monsters. This is insanely good AoE clear, but it kind of falls off later on. So this is something you just use in the early game, maybe up to 50, up to 60 or so, you can run with that. And then later on, this gets replaced. So this is basically the main change that happens here over time. And another change is that later on, once you have Codex powers and a bit of more mana regeneration, you don't need a generator anymore. You don't need a basic attack like Arc Lash anymore. So basically you start out like swiping your way through whenever you're out of mana, but later on, even as soon as level 25, this is actually not a requirement anymore. You can just like kind of spam Chain Lightning all the way, and this is also how the setup will stay for the most part. Another switch that happens over time is that you go from no crackling energy to crackling energy. So crackling energy doesn't really do much damage on its own, but it does have some utility impact. So for example, if you're like really running out of mana, for example in Omni Power version, I put like 2 points in Invigorating Conduit to gain mana when you absorb crackling energy. So you don't really deal damage with the crackling energy, but you can get an effect like this. And also down here is the key passive, the overflowing energy, that gives you cooldown reduction every time the crackling energy hits enemies. So you can run with Vias Master if you like, and if you don't want to do any crackling energy at all, but there are some other perks here. And especially in the late game versions, there is the Lightning Spear enchantment. So one reason to do this as well is that you can spawn Lightning Spears with the enchantment. Every crackling energy has a 10% chance, so you pick up 10 on average, you get one Lightning Spear. And those Lightning Spears, they don't do much damage, but they have insane utility with those stuns. So this can activate effects like damage to crowd controls, damage to stunned enemies, control glyph, for example, and it just makes fights a lot safer. You see here, there's not really many defensive tools. There's ice armor, there's no flame shield, but because you have all these stuns from the Lightning Spear later, especially once you have enough crit chance online, this is when you want to make that switch, and you have a lot of survivability. You have a lot of stagger on the boss, for example, if you want to stagger the boss. So those are the perks here. And the fireball, as I mentioned later on, just doesn't really do enough damage anymore, and you have to try to just scale your own damage high enough so that the chain lightning can eat through those big packs. So this is like the overview of the progression of the different setups as you go. And for the exact point distribution, you can see this here. So you start out, put some points in Arc Lash, maybe 1 point in Fireball is enough for the start, and later on you put more. Then you want to max out the Chain Lightning as soon as possible, get your 1 point wonders here, the defensive skills, and maybe like some passives here. You get a bit of barrier from protection, you get Align the Elements, and then up to level 25, you just keep spending more points into your main skills, because all of these are your damage abilities at the start, and then, as I mentioned, later on you phase them out. First the Arc Lash, and then later also the Fireball. So at level 25, once you unlock the Codex, you get some important powers, most notably Recharging aspect, you want to put that on the ring, and then the Prodigies aspect, you're going to put that on the other ring. These are two resource aspects, and they basically allow you to just always cast Chain Lightning. Chain Lightning restores mana for each bounce. There is also another aspect that you can find, which is called Unbroken Tether, that we're going to put on the amulet later. This is not in the Codex, but it gives you more jumps, is more damage output, and also more mana generation. So you can get started with the Codex with those two, and later on you actually just completely drop Prodigies. You don't need a second resource aspect anymore once you have a good roll of this one and the Unbroken Tether, and maybe a bit of like resource generation rolls on your rings, for example. So this is how that works later, but for the start this should be fine. You have 5 different cooldowns that you can use for the Prodigy aspect, so you can always refill your mana when you need, and essentially every single cooldown that you use gives you an extra cast of your Chain Lightning, plus the passive mana regeneration. Makes it very easy to actually just spam Chain Lightning all the way quite early on. As you progress from 25 to 50, you just start filling out some more of those upgrades here. So for example, we drop the Arc Lash, we're gonna get our Flame Shield here, so there's more defense and extra cooldown. And you also have mana cost there. You can get extra damage reduction from the Teleport, you can get the Vulnerable from the Frost Nova, you can get extra freezes and mana here from the Ice Armor. We fill out more of these defensive passives, and also down here are some of those lightning passives. So there's extra crit chance, there's extra movement speed, and less damage taken. And of course we have the Unstable Currents. This is the ultimate skill that whenever you cast a shock skill, you cast another random shock skill. So it can give you more Chain Lightnings, and give you Charge Bolts, it can give you Lightning Spears, whatever. So this is pretty powerful, and is like a very strong nuke ability. So at this point, we don't really go for crackling energy very much yet. I would suggest the Vias Master here, just to have like more damage output from the extra chains here from the Chain Lightning. We don't really need the crackling energy, but you could do that if you feel like you're starving on mana too much. You can put some points in Invigorating Conduit, maybe take them out from the movement speed here, for example, and then all you have to do to get crackling energy is change to Destructive Chain Lightning. This would allow you to have these crackling energy synergies, for example, Overflowing Energy, that I was running with later. So if you go to the level 50 setup, well, you can also do it a bit later if you feel like your Fireball enchantment is still doing a lot, but eventually it just kind of like falls off, and you want to switch your setup to this here. So this is the Lightning Spear setup that I mentioned. You get the stuns, and you can just like spread these stuns with Aspect of Shared Misery, for example. So here you stun one target, and then you hit them with all these Chain Lightnings, and it will just spread to the entire pack really fast, really easily. It is really powerful. And we go for the Crackling Energy synergy here. So we do the switch from Greater Chain Lightning to Destructive Chain Lightning. We drop the Fireball entirely and free up those points for maybe some more in Teleport. For the Lightning Spear, you can also go with Conjuration Master here, because every Lightning Spear that's active gives you 3% extra damage. And when you have Unstable Currents up, you're going to spawn a bunch of these. And also when there's like tons of Cracking Energy, sometimes the entire screen is filled with Cracking Energy, you can spawn like 4 or 5 of these Lightning Spears and get a pretty massive damage boost here. Then you can fill up some more of these defensive passives here. And of course you want to have Devouring Blaze later on for the extra crit damage. This is really powerful. It's the most powerful passive in late game. And you're going to have near 100% crit chance with this build, because it's so easy to refill your mana. And there's the Elementalist aspect that gives you an extra 40% crit chance on top of whatever you have, giving you pretty close to like 90% or so crit chance when you even have it just on the regular slot. As for your legendary items and stat rolls, I mentioned a few things already. The recharging aspect is definitely the most important one. So focus on rings. If you don't have this with a good roll, try to gamble rings, try to get this and put it on like a really well-rolled ring if you have a perfect aspect, because you want to keep this one around. This is like your main source of mana. And as I mentioned later on, you don't need the Prodigy aspect anymore. If you have this with a good roll and maybe 1 or 2 resource generation rolls like on this ring here, you can solve all of your mana troubles for all time basically. As long as you don't shoot into the walls all the time, the Chain Lightning will bounce from enemy to enemy and you always get your mana back. The good thing is that outside of the Unbroken Tether, almost everything is actually available in the Codex. So up here we have Snow Veil. This is the Ice Armor aspect, gives you Unstoppable and Armor. That's great. You have the Shared Misery to spread the stuns, to spread freezes from the Frost Nova, for example. So you cast something into the pack and then everything gets frozen really quickly. That's great. It's also in the Codex. We have Conceited. This is not in the Codex, but once you find it, you throw it on there. You have extra damage while you have a barrier, like the Ice Armor, or from the Protection passive down there, whenever you cast another cooldown. You have Disobedience for extra armor, also in the Codex. Ghostwalker. You can do other things here as well, but I like to have the movement speed, to be honest. It's up to 25% extra movement speed when you get Unstoppable, which you can get from the Ice Armor or the Teleport, or even in some setups with the Flame Shield as well. So you have that nearly all the time. There's the Elementalist, so whenever you are at high mana, 100 or above, you get up to 40% extra crit chance. And because you refill your mana so easily on this build, you have this effect basically permanently, and you almost always crit. So once you have this online, once you have your mana figured out, you have so much crit chance that you can really start scaling crit quite early in this build. That also opens up other synergies, like those stuns here from the Lightning Spear, for example. Then we have the Accelerating aspect. This is also not in the Codex, but it's just extra attack speed. So whenever you get that, you throw it on somewhere. And before that, you might want to use maybe some other offensive powers that help you out a little bit. Something like Smiting could be used here. You can do Retribution because you actually stun enemies with the Lightning Spears, for example. That's also in the Codex. So there are some other options here that you can run until you get this. And lastly, the Edge Masters here, just extra damage. This can also be Aspect of Control. This is also in the Codex. So if you don't have anything, you can also put an Aspect of Control, because you stun and freeze. For the stat priorities, one really important one is cooldown reduction. Just for any sorcerer build, you want cooldown wherever you can. That includes the Helm, the Amulet, and the Offhand. There's actually the implicit roll and the regular roll. So you can have something like around 35% or so with perfect rolls on all of these slots. And this just helps you to smooth out the playstyle, use the ultimate more often, your Ice Armor, your Teleport, etc. There are so many cooldowns in this build, you want to have that. And then resource generation. So outside of damage stats, this is something really important on the rings, because that gives you also more recovery from your recharging aspect, for example. So it makes this aspect more powerful, and just make sure that you have your Elementalist bonus all the time, that you can just like spam Chain Lightning whenever you want and don't have anything to worry about. But outside of that, you go for the typical stats: crit chance, crit damage, even some vulnerable damage is fine, because you can trigger vulnerable with the Frost Nova, for example. But it's not really that required, because most of the time you just like blast into a pack without vulnerable. But there's also a special stat for lightning builds, which is Lightning Critical Strike Damage. That acts exactly the same as normal critical strike damage, but you have more of it. So you also want to try to roll that on the rings and on the gloves, for example. And then there's other stuff of course, the Chain Lightning ranks on the gloves is very important, attack speed, and maybe stuff like all stats on your weapon or so. And the rest just goes to defensive stats. So you want armor, damage reduction from distant, close, burning, whatever you can get. Get all of these defensive stats on your chest and on your pants in particular. Let's walk through the Paragon setup real quick. We have 6 boards here and 6 glyphs, as you can see. We don't really have like any important like legendary nodes. They're all kind of bad for this build. But yeah, basically we just pick up decent rare nodes and try to fill in glyphs as much as possible. So we start here, we have Territorial. This is for close damage and close damage reduction. Here, the second board is the Burning Instinct board. This gives us the burning synergies with damage reduction from burn, damage to burning, a bunch of nodes like that as well here. And we also have Reinforced that gives us a bigger effect of those rare nodes and damage reduction for barrier. Then we have the Enchantment Master board here on the left, and also later on the Frigid Fate board here on the top. So here we put the Flame Feeder glyph, so more burning synergies and then more damage nodes, etc. And up here, this is the vulnerable stuff. So we put Exploit glyph there, that gives us the vulnerable synergies. We don't max it out really that much, it's only 29 dex here, but as I mentioned, vulnerable is not really active too often. It's just like a bonus when you sometimes have like a big pack that you have trouble nuking down or something like that. But you get a bunch of vulnerable damage there, which is nice. Then we have Elemental Summoner board. There's yeah, not really any important nodes besides the mana one. I chose this here because the life is nice and the mana helps you to stay above 100 mana so that you can do multiple casts and actually, you know, maybe not get all of the bounces back. You don't get the full mana recovery sometimes, and you can still stay above 100 mana for Elementalists. So this is why this is here. And lastly, up here with the Caesar's Conduit board, it's mostly there for yet another glyph. We put the Destruction glyph here with 49 dex. So this is the most powerful glyph basically, lots of crit damage here, and it has a strong secondary effect. Early on, while leveling, you probably want to put this somewhere else. So this is another dex glyph, and we have a lot of dex glyphs here. For example, Territorial is also one. I would recommend to, for example, put Destruction glyph here first, or Territorial if you want a more defensive side. But either way, you can swap around those glyphs a little bit depending on which ones you have leveled already and which boards you have already attached. So this is just like the final level 100 version here, where, you know, it's like the optimal setup, but, you know, a stronger glyph like this can definitely be used earlier on and then just like placed into a different board later. The good thing is that changing between the different setups doesn't actually require to change the Paragons very much. So the way that I built this, I think this is like a very solid all-around version. And for example, here even T100 pushes, I have exactly the same Paragon distribution. And for the Uber bosses, for Lilith in particular, the only thing I do is a glyph swap. So we have Tactician glyph here to buff the vulnerable damage a bit further. And we have the Exploit glyph here, and we drop the Control glyph because Uber Lilith most of the time will not be crowd controlled, so Control glyph does nothing. So basically there comes an extra glyph in there. But aside from this, everything else is the same. And there will be some tweaks you could make. I think I built this quite tanky, so maybe you don't need that much defense, for example. Could drop some stuff like Resilience, maybe some other life nodes, etc. over the tree, and potentially even attach a seventh glyph. But overall, I was very happy with how well-rounded this felt. And to show off some of the gameplay, what you need to know is that it's a pretty straightforward build. So as I mentioned earlier, basically a one-button playstyle with a bunch of cooldowns that you just press whenever you want, kind of. In the early game with the Prodigy aspect, you can also use them to refill your mana, but later on this is unnecessary. And you basically just press your Ice Armor or Frost Nova whenever you need like more defense or the vulnerable. You can press your Unstable Currents for the big packs. You have to know that, especially when there's many enemies, your damage will go down because all of the Chain Lightning will spread out between the different enemies. And when there's only one target, you have a lot of damage. So your single target is a very good, and AoE can be a bit lacking if you don't use the Barber Heart. So this is one thing to consider. And also here you can see it right now, suppressors are a bit of an issue with this build. So what happens is if there's a suppressor bubble and there is a target outside of the suppressor bubble that the Chain Lightning tries to jump to, it will disappear when it tries to come back. So you can basically only really fight suppressor enemies when all of the enemies are inside the bubble. So either try to 1v1 them or try to, like, you know, tank enemies inside the bubble, and then you can actually deal damage to them. So it can be a bit of a struggle sometimes when there's like 7 elites and there's one suppressor in the middle and everything is spread out. It's just something to be aware of. But with a bit of outplay or with your Frost Nova plus Unstable Currents combo, it may be just fine, at least on lower tiers when you're farming. Other than this, I hope you enjoyed this guide. I wish you good luck with your own Chain Lightning Sorc. I had a ton of fun with this build. I'm gonna be respecking this to Fireball, which I've also leveled a bit, and I want to see how that performs in tier 100, etc. as well. So I can also expect some uploads from me there soon. That's it. Hope you liked this video, and I'll see you guys next time.